So today we're kind of building on what we've been doing, really starting from day one, and analyzing what we read, um, building our active reading skills, and this transfers into the real world. I've mentioned this as well, sort of making you guys consider, what you encounter in the real world, whether it's news, and we're going to get a lot of that today because there's, sort of like some politics kind of involved in this. And it, started with day one when we start talking about like understanding and identifying main ideas and supporting details, right? That's like the fundamental idea. And where we basically just dissected paragraphs and whole passages to find the main ideas and supporting details there. And then we sort of moved into some more critical thinking when we started making inferences. So reading between the lines, as I said, and thinking about what is being implicitly stated and not explicitly stated. And then adding to that, when we started talking about things like bias and propaganda over the last couple of days, and looking for the language that's actually being used, and also thinking about, just because it's a supporting detail, whether or not it's relevant. We're going to get more of that as we go along here as well. And this overlaps. Not only will you be asked questions like that on your GED test, right, as far as like, make an inference about this, or, summarize this piece, or, what's the main idea or supporting detail here. It's really important in language arts as well, because that transfers to our writing. And largely what you're going to be asked to do when it comes to your writing portion of the GED exam in language arts is to basically say, why you support a particular piece. The question is always the same. You're going to support a passage of one or the other. There's no right or wrong passage to support, but then you have to supply your supporting evidence and details to do that. So what we're doing is building towards that. So yeah, today, evaluating the credibility of an author, which I've sort of talked around over the last few lessons when, mentioning when we see like talking heads on TV and people like that. So we'll go ahead and jump right in.
Hey there! Welcome to the lesson on identifying the credibility of an author. This lesson will help you evaluate the credibility of an author of both modern and historical political works. Now that you know how to identify propaganda and bias, it's time to apply those skills to political media. I know, most people don't like politics. I'm not a huge fan myself, but I also see that politics is an important part of American life. Our politics decide our government decides our laws, and our laws tell us what we can and cannot do. That's why it pays to evaluate the credibility of a political author. You want to know who's telling the truth, who has something to hide, and who's trying to trick you. A few years ago, when Roberto was about 3, Octavio and I moved to an apartment in his old neighborhood. Octavio wanted Roberto to have the same kind of childhood that he had, playing in the nearby Cornerstone Park. Imagine Octavio's surprise when we found the park overrun with weeds, covered in graffiti, and littered with garbage. Something had happened to Cornerstone Park, something bad. Once I got to know our neighbors, I started asking about the park. What happened? How did it get this way? Well, it turns out that Mayor Anders had given this persuasive speech about how best to maintain the city's parks. He wanted to hire a private contractor. The mayor argued that a company could do a better job and for less money. The voters listened to the speech and thought it was worth a try. But despite the new contract, the parks just got worse and worse. We don't know specifically what went wrong, but we eventually found out that Mayor Anders was friends with the contractor who was hired to do the job, and the contractor had made a sizable donation to the mayor's re-election campaign. If the voters had known that from the beginning, there's no way they would have trusted the mayor's plan. His plan wasn't credible. The mayor had a conflict of interest. Well, needless to say, we voted that mayor out of office. The new mayor, Mayor Bradford, canceled the contract, and the city returned to maintaining its own parks. Cornerstone is looking a lot better now. But still, if we had spotted the problem sooner, we could have avoided this whole mess. Let's talk about how to do that.
Yeah, so it's something we talked about yesterday, right? Conflict of interest, and it's going to come up here in several ways, different forms here.
When you're trying to evaluate an author's credibility, start by looking at the publication. Where is the author publishing their ideas? Is it in a newspaper, a magazine, a book, on the local television news? An author's choice of publication could tell you a lot about the author's credibility. Each type of publication has its strengths and weaknesses too. A written publication offers a lot more potential for depth and detail, but the information is less timely. You might publish a news story and have it be outdated within the hour. Audio and video publications are better at keeping on top of news as it happens, but are less in-depth. But let's say that you want to know more about the new congressional budget, and you found two authors that are saying different things. One author, we'll call her Andrea, gives a speech on the television news. She says the new budget will balance itself within 10 years. Another author, we'll call him Robert, writes a report for the Congressional Budget Office. He says the budget will increase the deficit by $1.5 trillion. One of these professional opinions is wrong. So which author is more credible?
We'll probably talk a little bit more about things like national debt and deficit. So deficit spending. Our national debt is something that accrues over all of time, right? So from whenever we sort of like went in the hole, right? When our country started running in the red, that whatever we accrue every year is the national debt. The deficit is a yearly expenditure. So when we make a budget and the federal government says we're going to spend this much on the military, we're going to spend this much on, social programs, blah, 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 blah. And then they realize, of course, that we don't have as much coming in as we are spending out. So whatever that number is the deficit at the end of the year. And then, of course, as that year rolls over, then it's added to the national debt.
Let's think about this and start to ask some questions. Now let's assume that the two authors have the same credentials. Both are economists. One economist, Andrea, is a political pundit paid to appear on the television news. The other economist, Robert, works for the Congressional Budget Office, writing up reports based on his department's research. Is the publication specific to the topic? Clearly, the CBO's report seems to relate more directly to the topic. The Congressional Budget Office specializes in congressional budgets. The television news might be credible, for the most part, but they aren't experts in budgeting. Would they even know if their expert pundit was being dishonest? Maybe not. The next obvious question is, does the publication have a reputation for credibility? The Congressional Budget Office has suffered some political attacks in the past, but their work is largely based on math. Since the CBO always shows its work, their opinion is pretty objective. The credibility of television news, on the other hand, might vary from one station to the next. Still, it would be very difficult for even the most credible news team to report with the same objectivity as someone who has specific knowledge of a topic. Last but not least, it pays to think about payment. How does the publication make money? Television news makes its money off advertising. They want to keep you glued to the television so you watch more commercials. Television news could put a higher priority on entertainment than actual news. That makes the credibility of TV news less certain than if they didn't rely on advertising. The Congressional Budget Office, on the other hand, is funded by taxpayers. They are paid by citizens to look at congressional budgets, so they are more likely to be a credible source. Now it's your turn. Try to evaluate what an author's publication says about their credibility.
Yeah, so follow up here. If you watch television news, right, of course, anything that's like on your local channels, uh, particularly like your 5 o'clock news and everything, what do they lead in with as their main story for the day? Whatever major crime event happened, right? If there was a shooting or a robbery or some other disaster, a fire, there's some tornadoes yesterday, right? So that they lead in with that because that's how you get your audience, right? They bury the feel good story about the lost puppy getting found halfway or towards the end of the show because they want to grab your attention. That's also a problem. I mentioned like the 24-hour news cycle. And so much of the 24-hour news cycle isn't news at all. It's commentary, but that's what people want to watch. So that's how they get people to, stay tuned in. And, all of television, whether it's news, well, streaming services are different because some don't have ads, like Disney Plus doesn't have ads, but Hulu places do. That's where a lot of the revenue comes from, is from advertising. So they have to find ways to, keep their audience. You watch any type of like reality type game show, American Idol, anything like that. What do they always do, right? When it comes time to, kick somebody off the show, they go to a break, right? So they make you stay so you can watch the commercials and then, they come back at the end, right? So here, anything that comes from a government source, yeah, it can be skewed. It may be biased to some degree, but a paper and research from, say, the Congressional Budget Office is going to be well cited. It's going to everywhere they get their data from is going to be cited in that paper. It's going to be referenced. And of course, they have, people that, do this for a living, right? They're researchers for a living. It doesn't mean you discount automatically what's happening on the news, right? The person that's there may have experience. They may be former, worked in the CBO or anything like that. But, the information that you're getting from the news is going to be shallower than what you would get from that type of paper. Right, so let's go on here.
Based on publication alone, which author would be the most credible source for news about a hurricane approaching Boston?
All right, Delasha, I'm going to pick on you. So based on what we have here, our four little entries, which one do you think would be the most credible source to go to?
Maybe the first one.
First one?
Yeah.
So the second one. So a national meteorologist from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So you can for local weather and stuff. The guys here, they're okay. NOAA is the governmental, the federal sort of organization that puts together all weather. And a lot of the information that local news uses comes from NOAA. Some of our local stations, and probably here in Columbus, because those are sort of, pretty big markets, they'll have their own sort of weather station and their own radar. A lot of smaller local news will just completely rely on NOAA's information. And, so they have their own radar, of course. They also have a lot of information, for a much larger range because they can look at satellite imagery. They can look at, stuff from several states away, when you see a cold front coming in and different types of weather patterns. So yeah, that case, a national meteorologist. The other thing about local meteorologists, they're not always meteorologists, right? I think for the most part, they do tend to hire people with a meteorology degree coming out of college. But some of them are just like communication majors and stuff like that. They're not always meteorologists. So that's a case too, where you might want to see, if you're evaluating the information you're getting, what's the background of your local weatherman? How capable are they of actually interpreting the data that they're getting? So yeah, the national meteorologists and all these dudes are certainly advanced degrees in meteorology. I've actually been to a NOAA weather station outside of Blacksburg, Virginia, and just the stuff that's going on there and the amount of data that they are getting just by the second is crazy.
Great job! NOAA is an American agency paid for by taxpayer money. Their primary function is to track and report weather. Since they have a reputation for reliability and report via radio, they are a credible resource for tracking changing weather conditions.
Yeah, I mean, they're all the information that they're getting is instantaneous, and just well sourced, right? That's what we're really looking at here is like, how much data is the author using and how well sourced is it? And, because that's what you have to do is evaluate sources. And that's what you want to ask of the author that you're reading. How well did they evaluate what they read? Moving along.
Back when I was thinking about buying a car, my 17-year-old cousin Samuel was full of advice. Get a V6. You'll want a turbocharger. Don't skimp on the stereo. My cousin loves cars, and I love my cousin, but he's not exactly a mechanic. And he certainly isn't going to give me advice on how to finance a car. He means well, but I can't trust him to know what he's talking about. Not yet, anyway. Maybe in a few years. But that brings me to the next step of evaluating the credibility of an author. Qualifications. The author should have the necessary qualities to speak knowledgeably about the topic. Usually, I begin by asking myself, is this a primary or secondary source? This is an important question when evaluating historical documents. A primary source is something authored as part of history, letters, journals, speeches, that sort of thing. Secondary sources are usually academic. They include books and essays written about primary sources. Primary sources, on the other hand, represent the people who lived in a specific place and time. What about expertise?
I mentioned primary and secondary sources yesterday. The way to remember primary source is just the data, the document, the video, whatever it is that is closest to the event happening. So a news story, whether it's in a newspaper or it's on TV. There's an eyewitness to a burglary, right, or an armed robbery or something like that. That eyewitness is your primary source. Historically, it could be a whole lot of different things, different types of documents. I had a professor at Virginia Tech that wrote a history of sleep in the pre-industrial age. And he found all these letters and all these diaries of these people. And it turns out that we used to sleep a lot differently. We used to have what's called segmented sleep because without like all the artificial light that we have today, people would tend to go to bed earlier and they would wake up in the middle of the night for maybe a couple hours and, maybe do some chores or write a letter, read a little bit, and then go back to sleep. Like sleep researchers were really interested in this because they thought it told us a lot about our insomnia today, Like if we wake up in the middle of the night, we get anxiety that we're not going to be able to fall back asleep. And that's might be a holdover from the pre-industrial age, when people did exactly like that. They would maybe sleep 4 hours, get up, move around a little bit, do something, and then go back to sleep for another 4 hours. But those primary sources, right, of people talking about, he would say, they would be writing in the middle of the night. So that's, because he had his own sleep disorder, so that's why he was really interested in it. A history of sleep sounds like it would put you to sleep, but it was really interesting. So yeah, that's the idea of a primary source, whether it's something like that, a letter, sometimes diaries, journal entries. I do military history, so things like battle reports, or particularly my research is on like the U.S. Army War College and the Command and General Staff College. So the syllabi that they used in any particular year from like 1950 or something like that as a primary source for me. So, and then a secondary source, like it says, is when you combine those to create a sort of a history, or a story, or a news report, whatever it may be. That's the secondary source. So books, magazine articles, stuff like that. And I also mentioned tertiary information, which is just often just fact-based. It's it's just stuff like Wikipedia, encyclopedias, or just information. So that's my spiel on primary sources.
Which of the following authors?
Hold on, let me go back. I forgot I paused it. Like, find out where we were here.
Back when I was a topic, everyone has an opinion.
Yeah, here we go.
But having an opinion isn't the same thing as having a qualified opinion. You wouldn't trust a grocery clerk to give you medical advice, right? Then why trust a politician's opinion about, say, education? Is that politician an expert on education? Expertise matters. Sometimes you can tell that someone is an expert because they have specific education on the subject. Does the author have an advanced degree relevant to the topic? You can still be an expert without an advanced degree, but having a relevant degree is a pretty good indicator of credibility. The more specific the degree is to the topic, the more credible it is. Last but not least, does the author have hands-on experience relevant to the topic? Having an advanced degree is all well and good, but sometimes there's no substitute for experience. You may have a law degree, for example, but that doesn't mean you're qualified to be a judge. You would need to try some cases first, get some experience under your belt before you would be considered for judgeship. Now, I know you're probably wondering how you're supposed to find out all of this author information. I'll admit that it can be a little tricky. On television news, a lot of times they tell you who the person is and what their qualifications are. Sometimes it'll appear in words at the bottom of the screen. Articles often have author information near the bottom of the page. Websites usually have an about or contact page that will tell you about the authors who contribute to the site. If nothing else works, I recommend doing a quick search on the internet. You'll probably find something you can use.
Yes.
So, what do you say? Are you ready to evaluate an author's qualifications?
I mentioned this yesterday too. Just because it says Dr. So-and-so doesn't make them an expert on, it could be that they're not an expert in what they're talking about. I went to college and worked with a lot of historians, Dr. So-and-so, Dr. this, Dr. that, Dr. that. I'm not going to go to them if, I have a headache, right? And they will on news, in articles, they'll try to pull a fast one on you a lot of times. And particularly they'll get vague about their expertise. They'll say, this industry insider. Well, that industry insider may have been mopping the floors, in the lab and not actually be, a scientist, or, did not work, right in that particular field. So, even if they state, sort of what their quote unquote expertise is, you have to be careful with it. So yeah, if you can, and I do this all the time, when I see something on the news, or I see some talking head, or I see something online, I'm like, so what is this guy's background? And half the time I'm like, why do they give these people, a platform, to say crazy stuff? And, of course, with books and things, typically somewhere, like on the back cover, or maybe in the inside, there'll be like a little bio of that, author. Even with fiction and stuff, you pick up a Stephen King novel, it'll probably tell you about, he's written so many novels, he's done this or that. Academic histories, they'll usually tell you where that person teaches, maybe what kind of roles they've had, some of their other publications. And what they also mention here too, where that publication comes from is also really important. Whether it's online, we've talked about this as far as, any type of news source online, just like on TV, it's prone to bias. There's, sort of sites out there that sort of monitor and watch, how different outlets are skewed. Do they lean, real conservative and to the right, or do they lean to the left? And the majority are pretty moderate in truth. You have some that go kind of, far down one way or the other, but for the most part, most of particularly with like major network news and everything, they're pretty moderate. They're fairly credible. All right, now we'll go on to our question here.
Which of the following authors is most qualified to discuss the process of evidence collection at a crime scene?
All right. Nautica, you want to give this one a try? Where would we turn to when it comes to collection of evidence? Who would you trust? Little bios.
Homicide detective Viola Rowe, 17 years with the NYPD, author of the book Terrible and Vital Clues. Lawyer Roy Hill, MA in law, 2 years as criminal prosecutor, author of news article Bad Evidence. Criminal psychologist Floyd Perez, BA in psychology, practicing 31 years, author of Evidence of Trauma. Lawyer Hugo Beck, PhD in law, 22 years as a civil attorney, often services as a TV news expert. So knowing that it's a crime scene, I'm guessing the homicide detective, Viola.
Right on. Yeah. So that's somebody with years and years of experience of collecting evidence, right? So, kind of somebody that's worked in the field. The lawyer over here, as a criminal prosecutor, probably knows a lot about handling or how to use evidence in a legal sense, but less experience. And, criminal psychologist, different field, not really related to, crime scene evidence collection. And then the last one too, he's a civil attorney. So not a criminal attorney, not a defender or prosecutor like that. So that, that would be really far removed from the other ones. So yeah, credibility here. Something else, to mention, it just as a warning, even if somebody is sort of working out of their field, you have to be careful about, just dismissing that person's, credibility. It could still be well-sourced. It could be, legitimate, because, particularly with something like history. I work in military history. The people I know work in military history. If we author something on, civil rights in the 1960s or something like that, you wouldn't immediately just discount it because my other work is on the Cold War, something like that, because we use the same skill sets, right? As far as evaluating sources and asking questions and positing that. So while they want you to make sure that, this person has the skills and background to discuss whatever the topic is, you know, every once in a while, somebody who's, you know, maybe an amateur or, you know, not in that particular field does a very good job of presenting some type of information. So you have to go back to the source as well and look at what they're using for their data and their evidence.
Even if an author is a well-published and qualified expert on a subject, that doesn't necessarily mean they're trustworthy. Remember Mayor Anders, the former mayor of my husband's hometown? He hired a contractor to maintain our parks. Unfortunately, it turned out that the mayor was close friends with the contractor, and he had accepted campaign donations from him as well. Many people saw this as a bribe, or at the very least, a conflict of interest. A conflict of interest is when someone has two incompatible goals. The mayor may have put his friendship ahead of his responsibility as mayor. Worse, he might have put profit ahead of his responsibility as mayor. Conflicts of interest can hurt an author's credibility in a hurry. So how do you spot an author who has a conflict of interest? Well, the first thing you want to ask yourself is, how is the author making money? Some authors are staff writers for a publication, like a newspaper or magazine. That shouldn't be a problem, so long as the publication is credible. Mayor Anders was paid by the city, just like any mayor. But he also accepted money from one of the contractors that he hired. Did that money influence the mayor's decision to hire that contractor? It shouldn't. The mayor's decisions are supposed to serve the city, not the mayor's bank account. You can't serve two opposing interests at the same time. That's a conflict. Next, ask, is the author professionally involved with a friend or loved one? That alone isn't enough to show a conflict of interest. Many people work with friends or loved ones without it being an issue. If the author unfairly favors a loved one, however, that could seriously hurt their credibility. Would you trust a positive book review written by the husband of the author? Probably not. Even if the book is great, you couldn't trust the author's husband to write a fair review. That would be a conflict of interest. That's the basics of evaluating an author's conflicts. Want to give it a try?
Yeah, conflicts of interest are really tough to avoid as politicians. You know, it's we mentioned we talked about Richard Nixon, right? That was where he had taken some or had used some you know donor money to like you know Prince of Speeches, whatever it was, but you know. It's very easy. We see these stories all the time where there may be a conflict of interest between a politician and some legislation that they're promoting, that they're trying to get passed because it may, you know, help a industry or a person or you know somewhere where they're involved. Our current Secretary of Defense, and this happens all the time, particularly with like cabinet members and things. So particularly as Secretary of Defense. So is Floyd Austin? I think that's his name. He, you know, ex-general. We have a lot of former military that served in the role of Secretary of Defense. This happened with I can't remember his name. So anyway, one of Trump's Secretary of Defenses too, who's the general, and I can't remember his name now. Man. Anyway, a lot of times when they retire, they go on to serve as board members for companies. In the case of Floyd Austin, he was on the board for Raytheon, which is a big military contractor. I think they make guided missiles and stuff. And so when he became Secretary of Defense, he had to divest his interest in that company. So you know, he had to you know step down from his position on the board, and he had to sell off his stock that he had received as part of his benefit package. So he didn't have any interest in that company because as Secretary of Defense, you could see where that would be a conflict of interest, having served as a board member for a major military contractor. And so that happens 99.99999% of the time when it comes to getting elected to an office or getting appointed to an office where you divest your interest in a company or your company, or you do not have any say if you maintain a relationship with that company. You have to really watch how you interact with other businesses, former, business, any type of business relationship you have before. 99.99999% of the time. There's been some exceptions of late. So let's take a look here at our last question.
Which of the following authors is most likely to have a conflict of interest?
Okay, let's see. I'm gonna pick on Jessica now. You're gonna have to look close at these because these all sound like they might cause a conflict of interest, but one is very, very specific about what it's offering there. See if you can pick it out.
Okay. A. The mayor writes a memo recommending his wife to a deputy mayor, pointing out that she is most qualified. B. A journalist writes a story about an organization that tries to trick journalists into writing false stories. A congressman author a bill that will help one of his donors make a lot of money in the upcoming year. A councilperson writes a letter recommending that her son be hired to work at it's A.
A. So it's actually C here, the congressman. I went through this earlier and it took me a while. I went back and forth and looked at these. I was like, man, these are really tricky. You would think that a mayor writing a memo recommending his wife, right, as deputy mayor, not necessarily, it's weird because it would lead to a conflict of interest, right? It's not necessarily a conflict of interest for him to write a recommendation letter or recommend her. But if she did become deputy mayor and he's serving as mayor, now, every action could potentially, between the two could make a conflict of interest. The journalist thing. Well, who else is going to write a story about that, right? So, it's going to be up to a journalist. That's sort of investigative journalism. That's not an issue. A council person writes a letter recommending that her son be hired to work in a mall kiosk. So those things does not cause a conflict of interest because that's going to be a different position. It's not with like the city council or the city hall. It's, a retail job in a mall, basically. It's weird though. I wouldn't have a family member, particularly your mother, your father, write you a recommendation letter, right? You should find blood relations to write letters of recommendation for you. So that leaves this congressman. So there, what we see is that, this is a direct conflict of interest because he is authoring, legislation that's going to help a donor. And we'd like to say that doesn't happen, but in fact, we know it probably happens a lot more than it ever should. And again, sometimes that's going to be difficult to, particularly when it comes to, like federal or when they bring in jobs to an area and stuff like that. So your U.S. senators and your congressmen are trying to bring jobs to your area, especially when it comes to things like military contracts, like building a new military facility and stuff like that. That's going to bring jobs. So there are people that are going to support that, right? And they may also be donors. But here, yeah, you know, when it's going to favor somebody that's sort of when you're in their pocket, so to speak, that's going to be a conflict of interest.
Great job. A donor is someone who donates money. The congressperson is accepting donations on top of their pay as a civil servant. If the congressperson is profiting from a donor, laws that benefit this donor might be considered a conflict of interest.
To clarify that as well. So a donor is going to donate to their campaign, to their office. You know, if a donor is bribing a congressman or a senator, that's an automatic problem, right? That's going to get you in big time trouble if they're, you know, greasing your palm for legislation. But what this is talking about here is just donating to your campaign for reelection or whatever it may be, which is always on the up and up. But you can see, why do businesses, why do individuals donate to campaigns, right? Because they want that person elected, because they, you know that that's going to be their best bet to get whatever legislation passed or not passed that's going to benefit them. So it's always just, you know, it always sounds a little bit shady, but you know, that even as an individual, I'm going to donate to a campaign because I want that person elected, because I feel like they're going to, you know, do the best job for our country or city or state. So everybody is somewhat going to be guided by self-interest. Okay, and that should take us to our practice questions then.
Very good work on those exercises.
All right.
Now it's time to do some practice. You can show what you've learned and maybe learn even more.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and let you guys work. We'll start with about 10 minutes and see how you do. I'm going to kind of maybe go through these a little bit as well to see how long it takes. I've just been kind of arbitrarily saying about 10 minutes. But if you want to go ahead, it's the lesson is what should be in your assignment. So if anybody does not see that appearing in their assignments, please let me know. But it's evaluating the credibility of an author. So make sure you see that in your assignments, and you guys take about 10 minutes to work on that. And I will stop sharing my screen there. not start my recording again. Any questions on that lesson? No? Okay. So again, my idea here, one of my objectives is to make you skeptical, not cynical, but I want you to question what you read and what you encounter in life. And just think about it and ask some questions about it. So we'll go ahead, we'll take a little break here for about 10 minutes and we'll meet back up for some language arts around 1:30. All right. Okay. We'll see you over there.